What is going on, Canes Sport? Izubee Charles, joined by Stephen Wagner for another Inside Canes Recruiting podcast. Stephen, the Miami Hurricanes are hot on the recruiting trail, more the transfer portal trail. With that being said, Canes added another veteran wide receiver to that group, being Cincinnati and FAU transfer Tony Johnson, who has a pretty unique story. Actually walked on to FAU, transferred to Cincinnati, and then became, a Big 12 star that, eventually led back to South Florida, committing to the Miami Hurricanes. Now Miami has two wide receivers in that 2025 portal haul. Just even with Tony Johnson bringing, veteran presence and dynamic playmaking skills to Coral Gables. What are your thoughts about this get for the Hurricanes?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll be honest, and I said this on Good Morning Cane Sport yesterday. The overall Miami receiver haul, isn't really, incredible. It's not out of this world, or at least in the portal. Because I mean, let's kind of be honest with ourselves. Trevor Pena was the one guy in the portal at receiver that we all kind of looked at and said, "Yeah, that dude's a stud. That dude would make your team significantly better." Now, is that saying that Keelan Marion and Tony Johnson aren't guys who are going to make Miami significantly better? Of course not. In fact, I'm a pretty big fan of Keelan Marion, and I think Tony Johnson is a pretty solid player because he played quite a bit at Cincinnati last year. But when you kind of look at, how Miami's receiver room is shaking up, I mean, honestly, I kind of lean toward, what Miami added is more being depth fillers than anything else. And I've said before, I don't have any problem whatsoever with going to the transfer portal looking for depth, because whenever you look at kind of, the guys that Miami is probably going to lean on the most at receiver this year, I mean, they are going to be, guys that have been in their system, guys that, they have developed, they've recruited, guys that they identified out of high school. I mean, heck, even last year, we saw Xavier Restrepo and Jacoby George. I mean, they were, and Isaiah Horton, they were, the stars of the show at the receiver position. I mean, yeah, they brought in Sam Brown, but, Sam Brown, wasn't exactly, taking key targets away from those guys. I mean, Miami has had the most success with guys that they have identified and had in their system for a number of years. And I'm starting to feel like that's becoming more and more important the longer that Mario Cristobal sticks around, and the longer that, more importantly, Shannon Dawson sticks around. Because now I think, especially this year, we're going to see even more receivers who, since they've been in college, all they've really known is Shannon Dawson's playbook. I mean, Josiah Trader, I think, is going to have a huge year. He's pretty familiar with Shannon Dawson's playbook. Malachi Tony, the freshman who we think is going to explode on the scene. He's only a true freshman, but even still, the only college playbook that he's known so far is Shannon Dawson's. So, yeah, I do like them adding Keelan Marion and Tony Johnson because, frankly, Miami needs the depth at receiver. They just straight up need the numbers. They didn't have enough guys in the receiver room. I don't think that, you want to go through a season with only, 6 or 7 or 8, scholarship receivers. You want more depth than that. So I do like them getting Tony Johnson and Keelan Marion. But, again, we kind of have to be honest with ourselves. There was one real true free agent type of receiver in the spring portal window through no fault of Miami's. And that was Trevor Pena. And I think that, they were kind of hoping that, the fruits, there would be more options, frankly, in the spring portal window. But I mean, the options just weren't there.
Yeah, well, you just called a spade a spade. I can't argue with that one. Obviously, everyone expected the big whales and all that good stuff. But Miami's making do with what is available in that transfer portal. And like Steven mentioned, these aren't superstars, but these are guys that have proven that they can play at the Power 5 level and produce. And, obviously with Miami having that really, really young receiver room with C.J. Daniels being the only senior, no juniors in this, obviously, or a junior in Ray Joseph, but only sophomores. After that, you need that depth, you need that veteran presence in the room, and God forbid someone goes down. Knock on wood. You need bodies that have produced at the highest level, and I feel like Keelan Marion and Tony Johnson are guys that can come in, be impact players for the Hurricanes, and hopefully kind of have those breakout years that you expect when you bring in a guy through the transfer portal that was productive at a previous school. And before we move on to other targets and guys that are visiting Miami, one thing that I really did like that you said, Steven, was every time Miami does bring in a portal guy, example, Sam Brown. Other guys step up. Isaiah Horton, for example, he has this kind of breakout year last year when they bring in Sam Brown. The year before that, they bring in Harold from Louisville, the speedster, a guy that they really thought was going to, break out on the scene. And then Jacoby George steps up. And, I had conversations with a few, people down there in Coral Gables, and they said that seems to be the case when you bring in, more competition. The guys that have been in that program, the South Florida guys that, know the playbook, say, hey, man, they're bringing somebody to take my spot. Let me step up and, be that guy. And I think this year we'll see a similar thing with JoJo Trader. Obviously, a little bit of a different situation, but they are bringing extra pieces. And I think he's going to say, hey, you're bringing in guys, but I'm all you need right now. Obviously, I'm not going to say there's going to be drama in that receiver room, but I do see JoJo Trader stepping up and, having that breakout year for the Canes this year. So super excited to see, that wide receiver room come together. I don't think they'll be adding any more pieces. I'll be surprised if they do add a third wide receiver, but hey, you never know with that. But going to flip to the defensive side of the ball, talk about a safety out of Houston, AJ Halsey, who's currently on his official visit right now as we record this on Thursday. And Steven, you had the chance to catch up with him, in the midst of his OV. Just kind of talk about that conversation with AJ Halsey. Where do you think things stand between the two sides?
Yeah, obviously, NIL plays a factor in every single transfer portal recruitment. We can't act like it doesn't. It's the elephant in the room that you can kind of talk about, but you can't really talk about without breaking too many NCAA rules and this and that. But all things being equal, I really like the position that Miami is in for Halsey. I think that again, all things being equal, I would probably lean a little bit toward Miami right now for Halsey. I think the Hurricanes are in a fantastic position right now. I think that the reconnection with Zach Etheridge definitely impressed Halsey. I think kind of Miami's legacy with producing all these elite DBs definitely impressed him. I mean, that being said, LSU also has a pretty good history of producing top tier defensive backs. But I think Mario Cristobal impressed him. Really, I think all the pieces are there for him to potentially end up at Miami. Definitely not making any, like RPMs yet or anything like that. But I definitely do feel good and encouraged by where things sit with Miami. I think this visit went, pretty much as well as Miami could have hoped it could be. And from what I'm hearing, it's starting to sound like the Hurricanes are starting to pick up some confidence too.
That's awesome to hear. Obviously, safety is positioned, on that back end of that defense with corner kind of set, but with Zachariah Porter holding that one safety spot, that other safety spot's kind of, in the open with guys like Marquise Williams, Dylan Day, Amari Wallace kind of fighting for that position, and bringing in, like I said, another veteran piece that's played, at the Power 4 level would be absolutely massive for the Hurricanes. And like you mentioned, that connection with Zach Etheridge, who, really helped Houston's secondary improve last year with guys like Halsey and a few other guys, in that mix as well. So super excited to see, what decision he comes to when he does come down to that decision. But, just checking out his social media, he looks like he's having a blast in Miami. Posting pictures, of different apartments down there in South Florida, posting videos of him getting escorted through the busy I-95, as we all know how brutal that is in South Florida. So it seems like he's having a good time, and the Canes are putting their best foot forward. So hopefully that leads to a commitment from him. And obviously, with the portal going on, we still do have a lot going on with the high school recruits as well. We just can't talk enough about this guy. We talked at length about him on last week's podcast, and that is number one recruit Jackson Cantwell. And Steven, you have the freshest update, off his visit to Oregon. Had the chance to speak with his mother, who said a lot of things. So obviously, we still don't know where Jackson Cantwell is going to go. Jackson doesn't know where he's going to go. But Steven, after conversations with his mom, kind of what's the latest you're hearing on that, whole recruitment?
Yeah, Oregon definitely moved the needle for Jackson on his last visit. It was really, really important for the Ducks to get him to campus because he actually hadn't been there since last June. Dan Lanning had been out to his school. Ducks have obviously been recruiting him very, very hard. But it's kind of hard to get from Nixa, Missouri, and you have to drive to Kansas City, to fly from Kansas City all the way to a very small airport in Eugene, Oregon, and then get to campus. Obviously not a crazy amount of flights from Kansas City, Missouri to Eugene, Oregon. But last time he was down there was back in June for, really just kind of like a quick visit where he really wasn't able to go into a crazy amount of depth or anything. So this weekend really was the big opportunity for Oregon to kind of, really, have one final chance to roll out the red carpet for Jackson. They absolutely did that. They made a huge impression on his parents. I think they really hammered home a lot of the track and field stuff with his parents. We've said a couple of times, his parents are Olympians. His dad was the silver medalist shot putter. His mother competed at the Beijing Olympics, didn't medal, but she did compete in the Olympics. Jackson himself is a really freaking good shot putter who's expressed interest in track and field at the college level. He's also said before that Dan Lanning is his favorite head coach from a recruiting standpoint. But coming off the visit, kind of the way that I'm feeling right now is I would still lean toward Georgia. I do think Georgia's in the most favorable position. Um, I do think that Miami really is, right there in that number two slot, but I'm losing confidence in Miami, just kind of, based on the vibes that I'm getting right now. If I had to lean toward a school right now, I would say Georgia. I know I said last week on the podcast that I didn't know where he was going to end up. I really didn't. Right now, with the way that things sit, I would lean toward Georgia. I'm no longer, ready to, or I'm no longer going out a limb and, saying that, I'm ready to say he's going to be a hurricane. And I'm, proudly saying that, he's going to come here. New information became available. I'm leaning toward Georgia. I think Oregon is still in this mix too. But right now, I really do lean toward Georgia.
Yeah, and we still are about 2 weeks out from his commitment on May 13th. Excuse me, it was supposed to happen on the 30th. But hey, a lot can change in that amount of time, and we saw that with him moving that date back, setting 2 more visits, and all that good stuff. So hopefully something does change in favor of Miami. Maybe they sneak in one final visit like Oregon and Georgia did, but we all know Miami did put their best foot forward, getting him down, this spring, obviously showing him a good time spending multiple days down there in Coral Gables. And now we're all in wait and see mode. Obviously, Georgia will get that last laugh, that last visit from him, which is absolutely crucial in the recruitment. So we'll just have to see if he ends up either a Duck, Bulldog, or Hurricane. And I know everyone watching this is hoping that he ends up at Coral Gables, and would be a huge recruiting one for Mark Cristobal and those guys. But like I just said, we're in wait and see mode. But as we all know, Jackson Campbell isn't the only prospect in that 2026 class. And recently, spring football started in the Sunshine State, and we've been out, checking out on some of the guys over the last 2 days. I've had the chance to catch up with 2026 Miami commit Joel Irvin and 2026 Miami target Ashari Charles out of Venice High School. I'll start with Irvin. This is my second time watching him, in a practice setting, kind of just, going through the motions and things like that. First time was last year when he was, still kind of making a name for himself at Fort Myers High School. Fast forward a year, he's committed to the Canes, and I'm really, really impressed with what I've seen from him. Obviously, his size is something that we talk about at length. 6'7", 330 pounds, but he does not move like that. Moves very, very fluidly for his size. Doesn't have, lazy, dragging his legs and things like that. Obviously, it's the first, day of spring football, or was the first day of spring football. So conditioning and, getting in shape is going to be a part of that. But just from a pure athleticism standpoint, he does not look like he carries that weight badly at all. And you talk to his coaches and, they say, hey, this young man is still very young, has a lot to improve, but everything is there. And Coach Mirabal and those guys really, really love Joe Irvin and, what he can bring to the table. Because, something like they always say, you can't teach size, and Joel has that. And, excited to see what the future holds for him and how he continues to develop over the spring and into the fall. And with Ashari Charles, he's one of those guys that just looks, day one ready. One of those, A+ guys when he comes off the bus. He said, hey, this kid, has it all. And having the chance to speak with those guys at Venice, super, super highly of him. He was the guy leading the practices. So he has those leadership traits. And, he's been productive at Venice High School, which is, one of the best high schools in the Sunshine State. And Miami is, one of his top programs. Also mentioned Louisville, Penn State, and Missouri as some schools, really gaining traction in his recruitment. But Miami's there, and he will take and visit 2 Coral Gables later this summer. And, Stephen, obviously a ton of more prospects we'll be seeing this spring, but just who are some guys you're excited to see over the next few weeks and get a closer eye on?
Definitely Justice Fitzpatrick. This is going to be our first time getting to see him since he played in the state championship game. I'm really interested to kind of see how he looks from a versatility standpoint, because he can play safety, he can play corner. I think he potentially has a skill set to play nickel too. So I'm kind of interested in seeing, how he moves across the field. Definitely, one of Miami's top DB priorities in this year's class. Another guy that I'm interested in seeing at St. Thomas. This is actually a 2027 kid, but Mark Matthews. He was named the number 2 overall prospect in the On 300 earlier this spring. He's right up the street from Miami, big time prospect for the Hurricanes in next year's class. He will be a major priority whenever we get there. I'm kind of interested to see Daniel Norman too, also at St. Thomas, 2026 edge who recently got made a 4-star prospect. I think he's like top 160, top 150, somewhere around that range right now. Miami hasn't really turned the heat up on him yet, but objectively, it would make a lot of sense if Miami did end up deciding to go after him. Local 4-star at a in Miami's pipeline, at a local powerhouse. Proven productive. Yeah, I definitely can see Miami saying, kind of from an image standpoint, that they don't want to let this kid get away. Just from the image of saying, we're not going to allow a local 4-star prospect at a pipeline school, end up going somewhere else. Not that I think that will happen yet, but I absolutely could see it happen because I know that Miami's continuing to evaluate him, and they definitely have a little bit of interest in him. So it wouldn't stun me if we see him back on campus at some point too, although I'm definitely not ready to predict when. Let's see, going south, I guess, at Miami Central, Karan Maycock, obviously. I think he's one of the highest floor linebackers that Miami's going after right now and then over at Miami Northwestern. Huge name has to be Calvin Russell. I mean, kid's a stud. Miami really wants him. It sounds to me like he's leaning a little bit towards Syracuse, but we'll see what happens. I'm excited to see him in the spring too.
Yeah, a lot of big time guys, not only in South Florida, but across the entire state that we're going to be, checking out over the next few weeks. So make sure to stay tuned with canesport.com. Also our Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where we'll be posting, practice highlights, kind of getting an in-depth look at these guys and kind of, what they look like, how they train, and all that good stuff. So make sure to check out, all those updates as we have those funneling throughout the spring, and make sure to check out our portal updates as we'll have those continue to be flowing through the sites and everything in between. So for Stephen Wagner, I'm Izubee Charles. Thank you all for watching. Have a great rest of your day.